Hi, good evening. Hope you're doing great and safe. And welcome to our new lecture together. I hope you're ready to start. As I said, these three lectures are very connected and important. So I hope you're ready to join me in our new lecture, lecture 15. Let's start. We're in the second part of understanding modern democracy. So, what do you think we're going to talk about today? We have a lot of issues to talk, and let's discover it together. Okay, let's complete where we just stopped in the last lecture. We already started to talk about features, elements that determine the shape of the new democracy, how new democracy started and shapes. We talked about institutions. I think it's the time to talk about more about the work, the function of these institutions, and the relation between the institutions and the citizens. If you still remember, we talked about that um, the modern democracy is depending on the separation between power, but we didn't talk exactly how these are functioned and the sense of the relation with citizens, how these powers, authorities are working closely with people and with nation. Actually, this is the other aspect of building democratic communities. So to see how things gonna work between people, community, and the democratic state or democratic government, we need to see the function or the relation between the government as an executive party or executive power and people and citizen. That's why here we're going to talk about the set of rights and responsibilities. Democracies set upon the principle that government exists to serve the people. In other words, the people are citizens of the democratic state, not in its subjects. Because the state protects the rights of citizens, they in turn gives the state their loyalty and obedience in a way. But have a look, for example, for any authoritarian system. By contrast, the state demands complete loyalty and service from its people without any conditional obligation to secure their consent for its actions. So, even if the relation is talking about rights and responsibilities, the degree of loyalty is a very critical question here. The degree of to which level people should pay the government is a very concernative issue, is a very problematic and dilemma. Um, when we do talk about rights and responsibilities and how people should be loyal or obey the government, definitely we should remember what we talked previously about the human security and the fundamental rights for people. How we should make the balance or create the balance between obeying the government, being loyal to the government, and protect the set of rights. This question bring a lot of issues, studies, and participation by scholars, and they decided upon one particular issue, which is there is a set of fundamental rights that no one supposed to touch or affect. This relationship between citizens and state is fundamental to develop a democratic community. In the words of the U.S. Declaration of the Independence, for example, Thomas Jefferson in 1776 wrote a very clear state about this relation. Let's see what did he said. What did he say? He said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endued by their Creator with certain and unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That state was a very important declaration, a very statement, a clear declaration in the history of a human rights, saying that no matter why and how or in what sense the government is building, the right or the set of the human rights should be untouchable. And unlabeled rights, upon his perspective, include freedom of speech, expression, freedom of religion, freedom to assembly, and the right to equal protection before the law. This is by no means an very comprehensive list of the rights that citizens enjoy in any democratic state. But it does, in a way, constitute a set of uh, incredible, if we can say it, core rights that any democratic government worthy of the name must uphold, since they exist independently of government. In Jefferson's view, these rights cannot be legislated away, nor should they be just to the home of an electorate majority. So again, to summarize what he was saying, and to summarize the idea of an unalienable rights, there is a set of rights that you could never ever touch in any community that you are building, especially if you're seeking to build a democratic community. Another important set of rights that governments should take into consideration, or any community should take into consideration, according to the relation between government and citizen, is the right to speech, assembly, and protest. People see the political participation in the sense only of electing certain representatives. Actually, it is not. The political participation concept derived from the right to citizen, the right of any citizen to see, observe, participate, protest, and express his or her opinion in the government in any sense. And that's the reason behind putting the right to speech, assembly, and protest in a separate column. Freedom and speech and expression, especially about political issues, social issues, economic issues, and the lifeblood of democracy, um, is the lifeblood of democracy, actually. Democratic governments cannot control all contexts of written or verbal speech, especially with the nowadays social media, the revolution in social media, actually. However, it is always a dilemma to um, for any government to control what people say and work. Democracies are usually filled with many voices expressing different or even contrary ideas and opinions. Democracies tend to be noisy in a way. Uh, and this is a little bit confusing because when we were talking about loyalty, tolerance, we were talking about certain arrangements. And here they are talking about this noisy issue. So, to see whether it is noisy or is it organized, I think you need to look how this community built upon certain cultural issues. Democracy actually depends upon a literature, knowledge, citizenship, cultural background, whose access to information enables it to participate as fully as possible in the public life of society and to criticize unwise or oppressive government officials of the government or any policies they think it doesn't serve them well. Citizens and their access to centralized ideas, data, and opinion is the source of this idea. For free people to govern themselves, they must be free to access themselves openly, publicly, and repeatedly in speech and in writing. One of the most important issues is to create this landscape of freedom, this landscape of ideas, of participation. And this ends talking about what they call the negative right. So the protection of a free speech nowadays called the negative right. Simply requirement that the government refrain from limiting speech. For the most part, the authorities in a democracy or a democratic community are involved in the content of written, verbal, or visual content that people are sharing and using or even posting on their social media. But all of this is not an easy practice. Again, this is a role, this is a law, this is um, a target that we need to implement, but in real life things doesn't go in that sense in a very nice and smoothly way, because you can see a lot of government accuse or even arrest people for whatever they speak on social media or any other news. So again, it is the question between negative rights and noisy and what we used to say the tolerance communities. Talking more and more about how we need to differentiate between the tolerant community, the noisy, and the protecting of the negative rights, we need to talk about here the about the other part of the political participation, which is protest and moving against the government in certain ways. Protests serve as testing groups and the ground for any democracy. Thus, the right to peaceful assembly is essential and plays an integral part in facilitating the use of free speech. So it is not only the right to speak, it's also about to protect your right and political participation against any policies or maybe agenda that the government will implement in certain day. Civil society allows for separate groups or separated groups to build and participate in debates among those and disagreement over certain issues or certain policies or maybe certain track or implementation by the government. In the modern United States, for example, even fundamental issues of national security, war, peace, economic issues are discussed freely in newspaper, in media, in social media, blah blah blah, with those opposed on the idea of on or the concept. Uh, Other communities, for example, consider talking about certain policies totally rejected and totally forbidden because this is the work of the government. So again, how this is balanced, how to create a balance between what people should say and when they are allowed to say and to protest is a key to understand the relation between noisy tolerance and the protection of negative rights. Um, we need also to talk about certain implementation here. For example, policy easily popularized their freedom of speech and fundamental right, but is not absolute and cannot be used in incentive violence. Like at certain communities, also the people are not mature enough to use these rights. That's the defense of government. Using certain evidences like people attacking the public properties, they are using violence to express their ideas, and they are considering this totally against the law. Standard and label, um, if proven, are usually defined and controlled through the courts. Democracies generally require a higher degree of threat to justify banning speech or gathering that may incite violence and truthfully harm the reputation of others or overthrow or constitutional government. So it is again to know or understand how this action that people or citizens will use or act also define the right and the limit between rights and policies. Another important issue uh, could be that how democracies deal with this. Many democracies ban speech that promotes racism or ethnical hate. The challenge for all democracies, however, is on to create this balance, to defend freedom of speech and assembly while countering speech that truly encourages violence, hate, subversion of democratic institutions that could increase racism or increase or at least um, threaten the social cohesion of the community in a way. One can disagree forcefully and publicly with the actions of a public official calling for his or her assassination is a crime. Like there is a huge problem or ambiguity in defining these issues because they are totally linked to how people appraised, how people think, the perspective, their way to express their ideas and their lives. That people who used to use violence inside their homes definitely will not express their political opinions in a very peaceful way. So again, the balance between protecting negative rights, building noisy community, and the tolerance is the key to understand the relation between government and citizen. Let's talk about another feature here. Let's talk about religion, religious freedom, and tolerance. Why we do separate religious from all the previous political issues? Because actually, the religious issue is one of the most critical, is the one that really created division, is one of the most issues that could really divide the communities and derive them. Another point that why we divided the religious issue from all the previous political issues, because a lot of political parties nowadays are built upon religious ideology, and they are using religion to separate or at least to build affiliations, to build the new tendencies inside the communities, and this end in a very dangerous way. That's why we decided to separate religion from all the other freedoms. Okay, in the abstract level, all citizens should be free to follow their conscience in matters of religious faith. Freedom of religion includes the right to worship alone or with others in public or private, or not to worship at all, or to participate in religious observation, ceremonies, practices, and teaching without fear of pursuing for government or other groups in society. All people have the right to worship or assemble in connection with a religion or belief, and to establish and maintain places for their purposes. The dilemma here is when this right is changed the face of the implementation. In other words, when some people or leaders using religion as a tool of encouraging people to follow certain tendencies, political tendencies, when religion turned to be a tool to control people and control their attitudes, behaviors inside the communities. Um, the right that the law and constitution and international laws we're talking about as to separate religion from policies and government, is to protect the right for everyone to worship, to follow any religion they want, to decide whether they want to build a constitution based on the religion or not, but definitely not using religion as a tool to threat other, or to at least direct the community based on these concepts or these um, ideologies. Like other fundamental human rights, religious freedom is not created or generated by the state, but all democratic states should protect it. Although many democracies may choose to recognize an official separation of church or any religion or any representative body for the religion and the state, the values of government and religion are not in fundamental conflict. Governments that protect religious freedom for all their citizens are more likely to protect other rights necessarily for religious freedom, such as free speech and assembly, for example. The American colonies, virtually theocratic state in the 17th and 19th century, developed theories of religious tolerance and secular democracy almost simultaneously. In a parallel track, they were talking about the right to believe and a secular democracy or a secular state. By contrast, some of the totalitarian dictatorships during the 19th and 20th century attempt to wipe out religion, seeing it rightly as a form of self-expression by the individual conscience, akin to political speech. Genuine democracies recognize that individual religious differences must be respected and that a key role of government is to protect religious choice, even in cases where the state snatches or divides religious from policies. Snatches a particular religious faith or they are following a different religious faith. However, this does not mean that religion itself can become an excuse for violence against other religious groups or other religions, or against communities or a society as a whole. Religion is exercised within the context of a democratic society, but does not take it over. The dilemma here is they are convinced and admitted that religion is part of the set of the fundamental rights. The only thing that scares the government and bringing the issue for concern and question is who controls what. If people are understanding and seeing religion as part of their freedom and not using it to accuse others, so it is part of the fundamental rights. If certain leaders or group derives religion as a tool or ideological tool to control people, to practice violence against others, to even ask others to follow them in a very oppressive way. So in this case, religion is no more part of the fundamental rights. Again, this dilemma is one of the most old and modern issues. And if we can see nowadays communities, definitely most of the communities are suffering from this dilemma in a way or another, either of the role by political or religious political parties, or certain protesting against the government by political parties or political movements and others. Okay, to summarize and wrap up whatever we were talking about in relevance to the relation between citizenship and governments, let's agree that um, there's a huge list of rights and political rights and human rights according to the international laws. But we are concentrating on certain fundamental rights where we're going to talk deeply about the general political and the human rights in the last chapter of the semester. But here, let's agree that we are going to discuss, or we are focusing and putting lights on certain rights which can determine the relation between citizens and governments, and maybe which are more relevant to the political participation concepts and practice itself. So we are talking number one about the right of self-determination, right number two, the right of or to liberty, three, right to due process of law, right number four, the right to freedom of movement, number five, the right to privacy. Number six, right to freedom of thought. Then the right to freedom of religion. Finally, the right to freedom of expression. These are the sets of fundamental rights we are concentrating on whenever we are talking about the relation between government and citizenship in a way. So, if we are concentrating on these fundamental rights, we need to agree upon certain conditions, certain criteria for these fundamental rights. Number one, fundamental rights are different from ordinary legal rights in the manner in which they are enforced. If a legal right is violated, the aggrieved person cannot directly approach any of the legislative bodies. He or she should first approach the lower court first. Number two, some of the fundamental rights are valuable to all citizens, while the rest are for all persons, whether they are citizens or foreigners. And this is one of the most interesting rights, actually. A third right would be, or a third criteria is fundamental rights are not absolute rights. They have reasonable restrictions and certain limitation for the practice, which means they are subject to the conditions of state security, public morality, and dignity friendly relationships with maybe other countries or other groups, other people, whether inside or outside the community itself. Number four, they are justiciable. They are implying they are enforceable by courts. People can approach directly in case of violent or a violation of fundamental rights. Fundamental rights can be amended by parliament or any, again, parties that responsible for the legislation by constitutional amendment, but only if an amendment doesn't alert the basic structure of the Constitution. Fundamental rights can be suspended during a national emergency. And this has happened a lot in century and 20th century and 21st century, actually. The application of fundamental rights can be restricted in an area which has been placed under martial law or military rule. Again, this is what we are focusing on. We talked about the emergency role in law that was first in Egypt and other communities. But the only thing that I want you to focus here, that we are following the rights can help us to see the relation between the government and citizens in a clear way. Thank you so much for this. Please be safe and see you soon.